Hello, my name is Mike, and this is a bike. In fact, this is a mountain bike. And one of the reasons I'm so bloody fat is because I don't ride it anymore. Now, what does this have to do with today's episode? Absolutely nothing. But I needed some kind of an intro where I could say, my name is Mike, and this is a bike. So today's episode is about putting our trike back together. So stick around. We'll put the motor back together, and we'll put it back in that three-wheeled monster.
Somewhere in a dusty, dirty back alley in western Arizona is an old fart trying to cram a square peg into a round hole. He'll work on anything, just as long as it has at least 2 cool wheels. Oh look, farts have arrived. It's kind of like Christmas, only for old farts.
Well, since our last video, I've done a little bit of prep work on our engine case. I've removed the bearings, and I didn't video that. I probably should have. The process is pretty simple. We take that cover plate off, and the bearings are a interference fit or press fit into the case. So what we do is we use a heat gun to heat the case up. When the case expands, we just take a socket like this, and we can drive the bearing out. Well, I can't really demonstrate it unless I put a bearing back in. Oh, here's the old one. So this is the bearing that was down here, and we can just drive it out with a socket. It comes right out. Pretty simple to do. When we go to put the bearings back in, once again, I'll kind of prop my heat gun up in a position where it can heat the case up and get it to expand. Now, some of you might choose to use a torch to heat the case, and that's fine. You may do that. I don't like using a torch because, well, I just clean the inside of this case out so there's fumes from the brake cleaner as well as motor oil. And motor oil has a certain flash point. And, well, because of my luck, even that FR soup may not be enough to save me from myself. So I use the heat gun. It provides plenty enough heat for that purpose. You'll also notice that the surface, the mating surface, is nice and clean. I went around and cleaned it off, removed all the old sealer with a scraper. And then those areas that I marred it when I was prying it apart with a screwdriver, like I'm not supposed to do, but did anyway, I took this flat file and I smoothed them out. I filed them down flat. Now, in most cases, there's an indentation. If it's a low surface, that's not a problem because the sealer will fill it just fine. It won't leak. However, if there's a high spot, that is a problem because the sealer cannot compensate over a long area if you have a high spot. So what's really critical is that you take and you use a flat file so that you can verify that it's completely flat in relationship to the surrounding surfaces that it has to seal against. So I did all that, flattened down all the areas where there's any kind of a high spot, and then I went over all the surfaces with some Scotch-Brite to get it nice and smooth and shiny and clean. And I'll probably clean it up one more last time before I put the adhesive sealer in. So now we get to reassemble it. I have one of the 2 bearings that I need. The other one, well, probably won't be here till a couple of days from now. So we're going to capture this. Another thing I did do is I verified that there was no metal inside the pickup screen for the oil pump. This is our oil pump. It's got a cute little chain. It's probably the smallest drive chain I think I've ever seen on anything. But anyway, this is our oil pump. I went ahead and pulled the cover off of it to verify that no metal contaminants got in there and scored up the impellers on the pump. And they were just fine. Fortunately, apparently what broke in this was not the circlip. And one of the dogs or one of the slides or something like that came apart. And all the components, all the pieces were fairly big chunks like this. So there wasn't a lot of small particulates that would have been picked up in the oil system and circulated through and damaged other stuff. So we were very fortunate in that respect. I didn't find any circlips out of place or missing, so this particular failure was not a circlip failure. I honestly don't know what caused it, but you have to remember when you're dealing with a trike, it's a little bit heavier than a stock bike. If you're riding two up and you've got a lot of luggage and so forth, you're putting a lot more load on this transmission than was originally designed. If there's a weak component in that set, that load will find it and it will break. So once I get my bearing, we'll go ahead and we'll put this back together and get her back in the trike. Any questions? You in the back. Yes, actually, you're correct. One of the things that we will do before we put it together is we will walk through the gears and make sure they all work before we put the other half of the case on. Because we want to make sure everything's working because we don't want to have to take it apart a second time. Any other questions? Yeah, it's down the hall to the right. Yeah. Don't forget to flush. Well, we finally have the bearing that we were waiting for. It has arrived, and we can go ahead and start reassembling the engine case. First, we're going to start by using the heat gun. I'm going to get this propped up in the proper location. We're going to heat the case up. We're going to reinstall the bearings. Once the bearings are in, we're going to put the new gear set in. At the same time, as we place the gear components or the gear shafts through the bearings into these openings here, we're also going to install the shift drum through this bearing here. The counter shaft has a nut on the back side that holds it to the bearing. We'll install that and we'll tighten it down. And then there's also a star wheel on the back side of the shift drum that we have to install to hold the shift drum in place. Once both of our shafts and our shift drum is in place, and while we're putting the shift drum in, we're also reinstalling the shift rails and the shift fork. So all those components kind of go together at the same time, kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. Once we have them all stacked in there in place, we'll just walk it through the gears and make sure that as we rotate the shift drum, it moves through the different gears. So that's going to be our next couple of steps, and we'll get the camera rolling here again. I'm going to speed it up so we don't spend a lot of time narrating. We'll just get it put back together. Once that's done, we'll go ahead and apply the sealer and put our case halves back together.
stop. Well, I went to walk through the gears, as they say, and I found that I had no difficulty going from neutral into first gear. But when I tried to go from neutral into second gear, for some reason I found that the dogs of the sixth gear on the countershaft would not slide and engage with the dogs of the second gear. There was something blocking the sixth gear on the countershaft from sliding. Actually, it's not the countershaft, it was the main shaft. Nonetheless, I kept looking at it. I couldn't figure out what was blocking it. So I took the gear set apart, and as you can see here, I've disassembled it further, and I found that this section here, you can see the dogs there, would not slide down far enough to engage. It's really scratching my head. So I got out the old service manual and started reading up on the procedures for disassembly of the transmission, because I hadn't anticipated having to tear it down this far, and found out there was something called NSA, or Neutral Selection Assist. Now, to be completely honest, I've never been through the transmission in a 106 before. I've been through both versions of the 92 several times, been through a 100 cubic inch, but not this particular version. So I hadn't run into this before. I was very, very pleased to find out that this is absolutely normal and that it was not going to be able to go into second unless I could spin the shaft. So I'm going to devise a way to check it before I finish reassembling the engine. I've got a couple of ideas. We'll give those a shot. I just want to make sure everything shifts like it's supposed to before we completely reassemble the engine.
I got the gear set put back in, and I went ahead and set the outer case onto the lower half of the case. I set all the bolts in. Now, the bolts are different lengths, as you can tell. Well, this one here is obviously going to be a little bit shorter than this one back here. It sits at a higher level. So there's actually, some of them are 110 millimeters long, some are 135 millimeters long. It actually shows you in the service manual which ones go where. But it's pretty simple. If you put it in, it sticks way up. It's obviously too long. If you stick it in and the threads don't engage, well, it's obviously too short. Now, while I was lowering the outer half of the case onto the other half of the case, I was also tapping on this area here so it would slide down over this bearing. Remember, this is an interference fit, so we have to kind of assist it and just gently tap it with a brass hammer, not a sledgehammer or anything like that. We don't really want to beat on it. As you can see, both halves are now fully connected to each other, and we see the silicone adhesive oozing out. This is the black oil-resistant silicone adhesive. Put a nice 1/4-inch bead all the way around. Now, I've just run it down with my little handy-dandy... where'd it go? Anyway, I just ran them all down with my Milwaukee portable screwdriver. But now I'm going to go ahead and torque them. They have to be torqued to a certain sequence. And we can see a torque sequence right here. Okay, we're going to torque them in a couple of steps. Where are my numbers? Let's see. It's here somewhere. Anyway. And I'm in kind of a hurry. The reason I was not videoing as I assembled the cases together is that it's getting very late. And I was in kind of a hurry to get this together. I want this adhesive to have a chance to set up overnight so I can continue assembling the engine in the morning. I don't like to do anything on the engine working with the rest of it until I know that adhesive has had a chance to completely seal up and set overnight. So that's just kind of my thing. If it sets overnight, I'm assured that it's not going to leak. It's not going to separate under vibration or anything else. That was on the wrong page. It still shows the same torque sequence, but you'll notice it identifies the different bolt lengths, and it also gives us our torque specification. Okay. Crankcase bolts, final torque, 22 foot-pounds. So they're not real tight. That's why it's really important that you get those surfaces completely smooth, flat, level, and clean before you put the adhesive on. it's the next day. Our silicone has completely cured and dried, so I'm not concerned about any possibility of leaks due to any of the further processes that we do. A couple of things we're going to do before we put the jugs back on. As I mentioned, I still want to check the gears, because if I do have a problem in the transmission, now's the time to take it apart again. I know it would be kind of a pain in the ass, but it'd be a lot less of a pain in the ass than if I already had all the cylinders on, the timing chain and all that stuff. So one of the things we have to do is we have to reinstall the output gear. There's an O-ring that goes in there, and then there's this bushing or sleeve that goes on here as well, and this is the interface to the output shaft seal to make sure that it does not leak. That's got to be put in place because one of the clearances inside the transmission on the output shaft is set by pulling this shaft out and fully inserting it into the bearing. So this has to be in place. The output gear, oh, come here, you heavy bitch, has to be in place and fully tightened down in order to center that shaft properly so you get the proper clearances and things turn smoothly. Now, when it was apart, I could have duplicated that, but as I mentioned earlier, I found out that I cannot do second gear with this transmission unless the input shaft is spinning. So what we're then going to do is, once we get that in place, is I'm going to attach a quarter screwdriver or something to this input shaft, and I'm going to spin it. I got to spin it to a certain speed so centrifugal force will cause those little balls to move, and then I can rotate the shift drum and get it to go into second. Once I've gone into second, I can complete through the rest of the gears and make sure all my gears are working. Once I'm satisfied with that, we will complete the assembly of the engine. So that's going to be our next couple of steps. To do is take a short piece of heater hose, put it on a socket, and then force that heater hose over this threaded shaft here. We'll see if we can get this thing to spin, and then I'll take and I'll shift it through the gears and verify that I can go through all the different gear ranges. Alright, so there's first gear. I'm not spinning her fast enough. Where am I going here? Going the wrong way. Well, the concept is good, I just can't spin it fast enough. So we'll try a different tool. Guess I'm like, that's faster. There it goes. And I have all the gears. That's nice. And that works. Now going the other way, it shouldn't be a problem. Let's see. Second, third, fourth, fifth. I'm not even in sixth yet. But now I can simply confirm all the gears work. And that's fifth, that's direct drive. I have one rotation per one rotation on each side, so that's correct. And let us check sixth gear. And now I have overdrive. The output shaft's turning faster than the input shaft. Okay, now we'll step back down through the gears. Fifth gear, direct drive. And I don't know the exact ratios, but fourth gear, slightly lower gear ratio. Third gear. Second gear. And neutral. And both sides turn independently. There's no binding, no clicking, no grinding. We're good to go. We can now complete our reassembly. Now, before I go and put the jugs and the heads back on, we need to clean the surfaces where the base gasket is going to sit. So we're going to clean this whole surface off, make sure there's no damage or mars. And we also want to take a razor blade and remove this little bit of bead that's protruding up. What we'll do is we'll cut that level and with the surface so it's nice and flat, and then we'll put just a tiny little dab of silicone there so that when the base gasket contacts it, it will have complete sealing and adhesion. The areas that tend to leak the most are where 3 or more components come together. So this is one of those situations. A tiny dab of silicone adhesive in addition to the gasket will ensure that it does not leak. And the same is true up here between the cylinders. You can see a little bit of ooze there from the silicone, and then again on the back side behind this one as well. Got a little blob. So we'll clean those off. We'll get our base gaskets on. We'll drop our jugs on. We'll get a set of ring compressing clamps to be able to compress the rings so that we can slide the jugs down over the piston rings. But before we do that, we want to make sure that our rings are oriented properly. So I'll walk through that procedure here in just a sec. We're going to need to collapse the rings. So you can't just use a regular tighten down type of ring compressor. You've got to use the type that can be removed from around the studs. So it's got kind of almost like a pair of pliers, and then you select the size that's most closely matches your rings, and you can grab it with these and you can collapse the rings in. And then once you're done sliding the jug down over the rings, this can be maneuvered out from around the studs, because that's going to be kind of our challenge. This is the type, you typically use these on boxer engines and V-twin motors and things of that nature. So we've got those. We're going to put the jugs on. So first we're going to put a dab of silicone. We're going to put some debris there. I'm going to probably clean this one more time. I already cleaned it, but it's got some dust on it already. And then we'll put a base gasket on it. We'll put our ring compressor on, slide our jugs into place, and then we'll put the heads on. Now, when we go to put the heads on, the studs and nuts that holds our heads on also hold our cam carriers. And you can see there's one of them right there. So these have to be assembled to it as well. And then they have to be tightened in a very specific tightening sequence. So we're going to do all that in the next segment here. And once we get the heads on and get the cam carriers torqued down, the next challenge is going to be getting the timing chains put on properly. But we may save that for the next video. Let's just see time-wise where we're at by the time we get the jugs and heads on. And I want to try and keep my videos to half an hour-ish. And we'll see where that puts us. So follow along. Here we go. one little trick that I learned. A lot of time when you have a stud sticking up like this, it's kind of recessed. These ones aren't too bad. These ones back here, they're a little harder to get to. So the way that I gain access to those, let's see where I put it, without dropping them down inside the engine where they get ground up into metal shavings, which are probably not good, what I can do is I can place them on the end of a 1/4 inch extension, something like this. Kind of hard to do with one hand. But if you do this, and you hold on to it, you can simply take and place the tip of your 1/4 inch drive on the end of the stud, and you let go, and lo and behold, your fastener's right there where it needs to be. And of course, I would have two hands. I wouldn't, you know, I'd be able to grab that nut a little more easily, but nonetheless, you can kind of see how getting into those recessed areas, it's a good way to get your nut and washer in place without running the risk of dropping it down into the works. Well, that does it for this video. We'll go to the next episode and we'll get into setting the drivetrain components properly, the timing chains and so forth, and getting the last couple of covers on. What the hell? It's already done. How did that happen? Unless I inadvertently walked through the black hole in my garage. Gee, I wonder if I can find my missing breaker bar and 10mm socket. I want to look around. But until then, we'll see you at the next episode.